I wanted to make a video that is not a Dune video per se, but continues the conversation that has been happening in my previous videos around this channel, and the subject of really the author's intent versus the subjective interpretation, and as it applies to many things, really. And really a kind of an epistemological vision in general, kind of going to the meta-modern discussion. But there's always this balance that has to be struck between what the author intends and what the reader is able to comprehend or understand, because the intention is not everything, because there's also the effectiveness of translating that message and how well they're able to do it. Because if they're not able to get their message across well, their intention is lost, and the meaning that was supposed to be clear becomes muddled. So I think that's some of the issue that's going on here with this Dune situation. Now, obviously, the adaptation here, the director has changed elements from the book, and Damien Walter said, like, oh, he had to do this, and it's great because he's trying to clarify Frank Herbert's vision for what Dune was supposed to communicate, at least according to him. The problem is, what is the market for that message? And why is it important? Why should we care that Frank Herbert has this message to share with us? And there's a lot of going back, to this quote that he talks about where, he said, like, the thing I wanted to say is charismatic leaders should come with a label like warning, dangerous to your health, or something like that. And that, this is a comment that he made many years after the original book was published, and after he had published other books which were supposedly designed to clarify the meaning of his message. But the problem is how do you communicate a message that people don't want to hear? And I'm guessing that his frustration and why he said these things later on, and which kind of is driving Damien Walter's upset, way with the way people are taking it, and the director Denis Villeneuve's issue is that people are taking this as like the hero's journey, and they're getting behind the character of Paul, and they're seeing him as like this great guy, or and so it's backfiring, I suppose you could say. And there's a few interesting details that I thought kind of shed a little bit more light on the situation. For instance, it is well known that Dune was not quickly picked up in publishing. Frank Herbert shopped it around to a whole bunch of different places, like 20, and it was rejected by like 20 different publishers. The guy that made it happen was this guy, Sterling Lanier, who worked at Chilton's Publishing. Chilton's, who made the auto repair manuals. That's what everybody knows, as the story goes. And he was kind of a weird sci-fi fan, and he was previously familiar with Frank Herbert's work. He had read it in the more serialized version when the story was published in some science fiction magazines. And so he's the one that kind of makes this thing happen. But in doing so, working for conservative, auto mechanics repair manual publishing house, he's putting his job on the line. He's taking a chance, which ultimately backfires because the sales are not good at first, and he gets fired. I don't know exactly how it came to be that this guy, Sterling Lanier, was hired by Chilton's, but you have to imagine that if there was anybody else that read the book at Chilton's, or was willing to say, if there was a secondary opinion that was needed to give this the okay or the go ahead, they would have had, that would have been somebody who has to read the book and say, yeah, this book's good. I like it. I like the story. Now, at a publishing house composed of people whose bread and butter is working on auto repair manuals, what frame of understanding is necessary for them to be successful in that field? Can they have subversive auto repair manuals? Can they make an auto repair manual that has subtle hints that you should know that if you're buying this car, you're going to have long-term problems with this or that part or something like that? Like, are they going to, you know, is there going to be a subtext to these auto repair manuals? Obviously not. Obviously, an auto repair manual has to be straightforward. And whatever was going on with those other publishing houses that all rejected the story, you know, whether they thought it was too bland, too familiar, not original enough, if there was some kind of a subversive message that was supposed to come across, you know, we have to question how subtly was that implanted in there. Because, you know, because if it's not done, if it's not clear enough, it fails, you know, totally. And this is kind of a limit that comes along with translation and adaptation. Things have to change. So for instance, in the first adaptation, the David Lynch one, in the book, what the Atreides have, their special thing that they are bringing to the table, is this Bene Gesserit fighting technique, which is more or less described as like a very highly effective form of martial arts. And so their soldiers are beginning to learn it, the Atreides soldiers. And now that they've joined forces with the Fremen, Paul and Jessica, the Atreides soldiers have been killed. But they have this technique that they're going to give to the Fremen. And the Fremen, with their high competency, are going to use this skill, and that's what's going to give them the edge. Whereas everybody's afraid of the Sardaukar, but the combination of the tough Fremen surviving the deserts with the help of organization and this new fighting technique pushes them over the edge. Now, in David Lynch's adaptation, he changed what this thing is, this weirding way, as they call it, and he turned it into this thing with these like voice modules, where it's using sound, and it's like a weird sound weapon. And, you know, he does some kind of interesting things with that, where, you know, they're talking about like Muad'Dib can kill with a word, and, you know, so it's like, you know, the voice powers that the Bene Gesserit have, which is kind of a, you know, a mind control thing, now goes into like this combat mode or whatever. And, you know, there's some kind of cool implications that you can derive from that, you know, like a logos power speech thing, you know. And I made that little clip about Paul talking about, you know, Jesus. If Jesus can heal with a word, then he could kill with a word. He chose not to. But of course, so that's an adaptation. So, you know, and that's the thing where like somebody can say they changed it so it's not the same, but it's like, well, that's a problem, because how are you going to convey on the screen that like this martial arts technique is so advanced? That's a very subtle thing to get across. You know, the people won't know that the reason why the Fremen are fighting is because they have this better martial arts technique. Otherwise, they would have to, like, you know, insert a monologue about it, which would also be an addition to the story. And instead, they go with this different way that's easier to portray in a visual, understandable thing. This is what they've brought, this new technology, basically. Now, that probably goes against some of Frank Herbert's vision, because he was very much like saying, technology comes to a dead end. The interesting thing is what humans do with it. So, you know, that's a problem with adaptation. You know, you can't, and so now you have, in the new one, and like in first, I still haven't seen the second one, I get my act together, but, you know, in the first one, and this was Grim Grizz's complaint, instead of it being Paul faces the Gom Jabbar, and he has the unique thing, the director, who is a feminist, puts it on the mother. The mother's lending her power to help Paul get through this trial. So that's an adaptation where he's trying to convey something that is not clear, and he is changing the actual content of the message, which that's where I think you get into this muddy thing. And if you want to say you're doing this because Frank Herbert wanted it to be about beware messianic leaders, and that wasn't clear enough in the text, and he has to change it, well, then he's monkeying around with the story and why it was successful, because people didn't sign up for that story. And in fact, if we want to be completely honest, the best, most successful adaptation of the Dune story was Star Wars. And, this was something where I grew up watching Star Wars, and I didn't read Dune until I was maybe 21 or 22, something like that. And I remember, I sat down in a bookstore and I read, the first 4 chapters or whatever, and I was just, immediately hooked. And then as I get through the whole thing, I'm like, wow, Star Wars just ripped everything out of this book. You look at when it was published and you say, it's so, derivative. But what was George Lucas doing? Skipping on paying the rights. That's one obvious thing. But he was tweaking it to get the thing more to that kind of shape of a story that he wants to do. He was shaping it to be more the hero's journey, more the Joseph Campbell thing, and but the amount that he steals from it is very high. But would we say that they are the same story? No, they are not. He changed his adaptation, if you will, changed too much to where it was unrecognizable, and so George Lucas communicated the message that George Lucas wanted to communicate, which was, here's a fun movie, and our kids are going to love it. And, it's a different story than Dune. So he changed it so much that it's not the same thing, which is fine, because then he doesn't get sued, right? But the thing that comes down to is, for any of these messages to have an impact, if it's a book, people need to read the book. If it's a movie, people need to watch the movie. If nobody watches the movie, it doesn't matter. Because I could have the most incredible novel with the most sophisticated message in my mind. If I do not get it onto paper, no one else will understand it. If I get it on paper and I can only get 10 people to read it, the influence of my story will not reach very far. It will not do what it wants to do. And I think the thing is that when you have these messages that are too subtle, they don't reach a wide audience, they don't resonate with people, it's because it's not a good message, or it's not effective. And what is the thing that the person is really trying to get over that people are not interested in reading? Most of the time it's, see how much smarter I am than you. I know. And if you don't get it, and here's where it becomes an elitist thing, because you have that person who, the book was much better than the movie, and they're a snob about it, whatever, because they get it, they get this thing, and you don't get it. Which I think you could say, now that's the case with Lord of the Rings, because as many people more have rediscovered the Lord of the Rings books, because of the movies, there's still way more people who have watched the movies and will watch the movies that will never read the book. So, for all intents and purposes, the message that most people associate with the Lord of the Rings is based on Tolkien, but it's really the vision as portrayed by Peter Jackson in his films. So that's what counts in a way. That's the canon. And I think you could say the same thing with Star Wars. Star Wars is a movie franchise, and Damian Walter complained, rightly so, there was better books. There was mediocre books written by Kevin Anderson. There was good books written by Timothy Zahn about what happens after the movies end. But because it is a movie franchise, once the new movies drop, that's the canon, and that other thing doesn't exist. It was a fake thing. Because that's how author's intent, or whatever, the creator's intent kind of works. It's connected to the medium. You know, because if nobody's going to read the book, then but the movie is successful, then the movie's what counts. If nobody watches the movie or reads the book, then it doesn't. The author's just doesn't have a very important message. You know, and I think you could look at this. There's a couple other examples I thought of. So, like, one is like in a satire way. You know, people like Stephen Colbert, when the Colbert Report was on, and people were like, you know, what's he doing? He's a liberal guy pretending to be a conservative guy. And so he would say things that were conservative things, and he would say it in a pretty serious kind of deadpan way. And what would happen is that the liberal people thought, and they were, you know, I guess you'd say ultimately they were correct. Like, oh, he's making fun of the conservatives. But the conservative people would say, he's one of us. Like, we like what he's saying. And the fact that it had that confusion, like, yes, the liberal people can get a good laugh at that. They can get the laugh of saying, I'm smarter, I get it, and you don't get it. But he kind of failed if the other people were liking it and not being pissed off, because he doesn't want those people to like him, you know? And the fact that he thinks that their point of view is a joke and he's expressing it well and they're liking it and reacting to it kind of shows that he's failing at doing satire. And I think you could say a similar thing for the, you know, the earlier example was All in the Family. You know, because you have Archie Bunker and he's saying all these conservative things, and Rob Reiner is like actually representing the viewpoint of everybody in the cast and the producers. But people have, you know, he's like this loser guy that's living with his father-in-law, and his father-in-law is a person who's able to buy a house and have a family, and even though he's old-fashioned and embarrassing, like, he kind of has the upper hand in the, like, who should I listen to? Archie Bunker has more authority than Meathead does. So the satire thing backfires, because we're supposed to think that Archie Bunker is stupid and Meathead is smart or whatever. You know, that show, it backfired. It backfired because it didn't work. It was too subtle. And, you know, people can get into like really people can get so locked into their worldview that they can't even notice this phenomenon happening. You know, and this is where I would say maybe this is part of the problem with like what the director of Dune is doing, or the people who are interpreting this thing in this way, that they're just so used to viewing everything through this like, oh, see, look at this, look, like they see everything not as it is, but as a reduced kind of straw man version of who the characters are, because they see them as non-persons, and then they kind of fit them into their category, and then they can laugh at it, or they can say, you know, I'm getting this thing out of it. And this works a lot of different ways, you know, like for instance, there are some people who get so keyed into like the conspiracy thing that they see signs everywhere of, you know, evidence of conspiracies or whatever. Like, and for instance, like if I go like this, there are some people who will now be convinced that I did that not to prove a point, but to actually signal that I am a part of a secret society and I am proving my allegiance by covering up my eye. And no amount of explanation that I can give them right now will ever convince them other than that, because they're like locked in. They're so keyed into this thing and they see it everywhere, which means that anytime somebody gets sand in their eye or something, or I don't know, whatever, you know, the weird like gestures, pointing things or whatever, like, I don't know, whatever they are, anytime somebody does it, if somebody sticks their hand in their jacket or whatever, like maybe they were grabbing a pack of gum in there, I don't know. Inside pockets are kind of nice. You can use them for stuff. But if you're using it and then somebody takes a picture of it, for all of time, you are part of a secret society, and nothing will convince those people otherwise. So, you know, that's like, I don't know, worldview blindness, I guess you could say. And And I think that when it comes to this thing, you know, like, so the interesting thing is that everybody's taking this quote that Frank Herbert said and saying, authorial intent. He meant it to mean this thing. But what they're saying he meant it to mean is almost completely antithetical to the message of the book. You know, it's a postmodern interpretation, and then they're kind of projecting it onto him. And that's to say, like, or maybe I should say their interpretation of what Frank Herbert meant doesn't seem like accurate. Because it's not saying beware, as in think through the whole thing, be critical of leaders. What they're really saying is that the story is about being dismissive of leaders. That's to say, those who have power have gotten it deceptively and are not worthy of having that power. It's not to say, you know, be critical, because perhaps that is the case. Perhaps people have gotten into a position of power through illicit means or with bad intentions. They're saying it's absolutely the case. And the proof within the story is that they are a leader. So this is a problem. Anytime anybody is in power, is in authority, they're a villain. That's your worldview. And the reason for accepting that worldview is because of what Frank Herbert said in 1981. So, you know, I thought of a couple other examples. You know, one of them is kind of interesting is, you know, there's a parable Jesus talks about with these two sons. He says the father goes to the first son and says, help me work in the vineyard. And the son says, I will not. But later, he comes and does help. And then the other son, he says the same thing. And the son says, I will. But then he does not come. And the interesting thing is that it's not one son who lies and one son that tells the truth. Both sons lie. The one who says, I will not, lies because he ends up going. And the other one, the one who says, I guess you could say the right thing, he says the right words, but he doesn't follow through with it. So, in a sense, words, face value of words can be used either way to dismiss people. But if that's what you're using to dismiss people, the face value of words they say, rather than the effect of what their actions produce, then, you know, you're using an excuse. Because ultimately, Dune did become successful not because people really wanted that subversive message, but because if the subversive message is in there, it's subtle enough that Frank Herbert could actually get people to read a whole book without immediately understanding where he was going through with it. And I think that those elements, you know, do come in. You know, I think, for example, you know, I would say I am a Protestant, and I affirm sola scriptura as a better way of making sense of what is true and than relying on a magisterial tradition. And I would say that Dune does a good critique of magisterial traditions, you know, because you have the doctor, and everybody trusts the doctor because he has imperial conditioning, which is supposed to be this flawless method of protecting them from being turn traitor, essentially, you know, which is what happens, of course. So what happens is everybody trusted in this institution, not realizing that there was an exemption to the institution because his wife is tortured and he's so messed up by it that it overrides this conditioning that he has. And, you know, the same thing could go for what Damon was criticizing and saying, like, this commandment not to make a machine in the likeness of a human mind is meant to be disobeyed. Well, yeah, it kind of is in a sense, because there's no, you know, it's not to say the question of like divine authorship coming into things, but because it's clearly just a decision that people came upon as a solution to a temporary problem, then it's not an infallible thing. It's a decision that people made. And when the time comes to ignore it, that's the best thing you do. So another example I thought of was in the Chronicles of Narnia and in the book The Last Battle. And the more commonly discussed one, I would say, especially in our corner, is the story of Emmett. Because Emmett is this young soldier who is good and faithful, but he happens to be from the nation of the Calormens, and he is very loyal to the god Tash. And his loyalty and goodness and all these attributes that he embodies are really in contrast with who this god Tash is supposed to be, because he's kind of like he's like Kali or something. He's like this destructive death god. And at the end of the story, so there gets to be this thing where people are discussing like Aslan and Tash are really the same thing, and that's a very debatable question, or it's not really true. But what Aslan ultimately tells him is that you valued goodness and loyalty and mercy and all these attributes, and he says those are my attributes, those are not Tash's attributes. So when you did all those good things in the name of Tash, the only person hearing those prayers, the only person who is honoring those desires is me, Aslan, the good guy, the representation of Jesus. And so we get that. But also within the same story, there is another conversation where people are very much discussing a similar concept, and it's kind of where the public group of people, including Emmett, kind of get this idea that Aslan and Tash are the same. And it's this conversation that's overheard between one of the leaders from Calormen and this cat named Ginger, I think. And they're saying, like, when you say that Aslan and Tash are the same, what do you mean by that? And what they both agree on is that they mean that there is no such thing. There is no difference, as in there's no such thing. And so you have a completely different meaning to the same words on the surface. Now, of course, that cat is disproven when he encounters the real Tash, who is not kind and good like Aslan, but is terrifying and murderous. So, that's just an interesting story within the book. But then if you go out into like the meta thing, another interesting connection from the Narnia story is that, similar to Frank Herbert's quote, there is this quote, this letter that somebody wrote C.S. Lewis a letter, and they said, like, shouldn't the books be like in the order that they happen or something? And C.S. Lewis said, like, oh yes, that would make sense. That would be a good thing to do it. Maybe if I was starting over, I would do that. And people basically took this thing like as this canon, like admonition, like C.S. Lewis wanted the books to be published in chronological order. And like ever since whatever, I don't know, whenever publishing things changes, that's the way they've come, like for a long time. Like, and it's awful. It's a stupid way to read the book. And everybody who likes the series realizes that, because instead of starting with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which introduces the characters, introduces the world, demonstrates, it's very clearly the book designed to be a good introduction. Instead, you are thrown into this second to last book, The Magician's Nephew, which gives us the origins of the world of Narnia. But it's not a good introduction to that world. It's a prequel, but a prequel is a book that comes after but tells about what happens before. It's not the first book in the series, it's a prequel. It's a sequel that happens before. And it's very frustrating because it's kind of almost like what people would say, like what order should you watch Star Wars movies in or something. Maybe you could make a case for the chronological order there, but like in the Narnia one, it's like you're gonna struggle through this book. It's not gonna make sense. It's not gonna be a fun read, especially for a younger kid. It makes so much more sense when they're already familiar with the world and the characters. So to say like C.S. and somebody made the point that like basically C.S. Lewis would write these letters or would say things. He wasn't thinking deeply about this. He didn't have a discussion with the publisher. He was just responding to a kid and basically saying, like, that's clever of you to think that. Yeah, maybe that would be a good idea. And that's like how much weight he put on that letter. But for some reason, we put all this weight on this letter, on this one thing that he said. And so here's the other example I thought of. And this is, Ayn Rand. I'm not a big fan of Ayn Rand. For some reason, somebody told me you should read these books or whatever. So I read The Fountainhead, and I remember having an emotional response to it, thinking it was a pretty good book. I think overall, it's a pretty good book. And then I read Atlas Shrugs, which was the boringest, most slog-wading through, tedious book I probably have ever read. And the only reason I finished it is just because I'm the kind of person that likes to finish books when I start them. And, the interesting thing about what happened there is that basically when Ayn Rand wrote The Fountainhead, she put a somewhat subversive character, Howard Rourke, into a fairly realistic world to make her point. So she was trying to, obviously she had this philosophy and she thought everybody was an idiot because we're all too nice or whatever. And she tried to get us over to her point of view through this book. Which is, maybe it works in some ways. I think there's a lot of criticism you can make about it. I'm not defending the book. But she was not so happy with the effect. In other words, she realized that people just enjoyed it for being a book, or they enjoyed the story. They didn't get the subversive message that they were supposed to get. And that's why when she writes Atlas Shrugs, she kind of hams it up. And what she had to do was not change the main characters, but she had to change the world. Because, in The Fountainhead, the world was pretty realistic, and the character bucked expectations, you could say. In Atlas Shrugs, she changes the world in order to make her philosophy make sense. And so what she basically does is make a world that's full of these people that she calls second-handers or whatever, that she thought were useless eaters or whatever, and she has this real contempt for people. And basically, it's showing us that her philosophy is garbage, and she was trying to justify her weird selfishness, including her weird sexual proclivities or whatever, the affair that she had with some younger guy, because he really got her vision, so it made sense that they would be together romantically. And it's a garbage book. But the point is that it's okay, she succeeded in her mind in making her message more clear, but it failed because the book's not as good. People don't want to read it. It's flat. It's two-dimensional. It accurately, it backfires, or maybe you could say it's successful because it accurately presents what the message she was trying to convey, and then people can just say, yeah, I don't like that message, I reject it. Whereas in the other one, the writing was better, it was more realistic, and it resonated with people because the subversive elements were far less. So my question that I think we really need to consider in a way too is, was the intention of Frank Herbert's message that he explicitly he explicitly talks about in this quote, was that present at the time that he began writing Dune, or was it only really present afterward? Because this is what, when we look at the case of Ayn Rand, she had problems trying to adapt her philosophy to the story, because sometimes things just don't work. And the person, Frank Herbert is not the same person after he writes the book as he is before it. And you can say the same thing for Tolkien. I think Tolkien probably was a lot more settled after he wrote Lord of the Rings, because it helped him process a lot of his thoughts and things that happened during the war. So it's not, he's not the same person anymore. And so I think, we kind of have to ask the same thing about Frank Herbert. And is the person that Frank Herbert ultimately became more convinced about the dangers of messianic leaders or charismatic leaders? Is that what informed that? Was that, informed by people's reaction to his book? Was it informed by the process of writing the book itself? And, ultimately, if he had made his message crystal clear, would the book have ever gotten published even at all? It's interesting because it is, when you look at it, it was a slim chance, the fact that we even heard of this book. And there's probably a million books written by people who really had a unique point of view that nobody ever will read or wants to read because it's not compelling to the average person. I'm going to stop it here. I'm going to cut this off. This will be the ending. I will make another video talking about other things. But anyway, hope that makes sense. Hopefully, hopefully this produces some interesting conversation. Thanks. Leave a comment.